So these sheets are from your Chaburah?
These sheets, I believe, are for my Chaburah, correct. Okay, the topic is Hayim yesh tzarach lebezdin b'sidur get b'hamista'ef. Is there a requirement for a bezdin when it comes to a get? This really seems a little bit like a quirky issue because it doesn't seem to appear explicitly anywhere in Shulchan Aruch and Hilchos Gittin with respect to such a need that there should be a bezdin present at the giving of a get. It's only indirectly referred to at best in terms of the discussion in Siman Kaf Kaf Gimel, for example, as to whether a get must be done only biyom, only during the daytime, and not balayla, the shita of the Or Zarua. And it also relates a little bit to the question as to whether a misader get is allowed to be notel schar, whether he's allowed to receive payment for his services over and above his schar tircha. The Bartanura in Maseches Bechoros famously considered it to be scandalous that there were Mesadri Gittin that were taking money over and beyond schar tircha because it's a violation of a dayan. Being notel schar lodun, so clearly he understood that there was some piece of dayonos involved in the Mesadri Gittin process. But the reality is that it really relates to even more than that. And this issue of a bezdin for Gittin really hovers in the background of all of Hilchos Gittin, which is why I thought that it would be an appropriate topic to speak about. The Masechta of Gittin starts off with a discussion, as we know, of a get ayidei shliach, and the shliach needs to recite b'fanei nechtav b'fanei nechtam, which is akin to kiyum shtaros, which needs to be number one in front of a bezdin, and number two, as a default proposition, needs to be bayom, like any ma'aseh bezdin. So in the case of a get ayidei shliach, it's certainly a relevant discussion. And secondly, the Gemara at the end of a Maseches Gittin, so it really is something that is that represents bookends on some level of the Masechta, also indicates clearly that at least in the case of a get me'useh, you need to have a qualified bezdin to administer a get me'useh. So the psukim in the Torah themselves don't give a clear indication of a need for a bezdin, except for the fact that we have a Targum Yona son on the pasuk regarding Gittin and V'kasav La Sefer Krisus, where the Targum Yona son indicates that it should be the Sra Beidina, that it's something that should be done in the presence of a bezdin, and then there's a question. He says kadam beidina, question as to what extent the Targum Yona son ben Uziel al Torah, when we know he didn't write a Targum al Torah, is a binding upon us, since we know it wasn't Yona son ben Uziel altogether. But in the case of chalitza, it says explicitly in the Torah we don't need a targum on it. It says we also yivim toshara l'zikenim. So that's the question as to what we do with the fact that we only have a targum on this and no psukim that would indicate that you need a bezdin for a get. So let's start with the sugi at the end of Maseches Gittin, where we have the dialogue between Abaye and Rav Yosef. Abaye saw that Rav Yosef was doing Isoy, was compelling Gittin, and he said, wait a second, we don't have the authority because we're Dayanim who are only in Bavel, right? And in Bavel, they didn't have smicha, so he says, and there's a halacha, Elam mishpatim shertasim lifneim lo lifnei ovdei kochavim, and also lifneim lo lifnei hadyotos, and we're only hadyotos. So Yosef responded on in shlichusaya kavdinan, that we can do shlichusaya, that we're considered to be the agents of the bezdin in Eretz Yisrael. Tosfos asks, but nowadays we don't even have mumchin in Eretz Yisrael. So Tosfos says that we have an extension of this principle, which is called shlichusayo to kamai ka'avdina, and we're considered to be the agents of the dayanim of yesteryear, according to the Kesos HaChoshen. Really, when this ma'aseh occurred between Abaye and Rav Yosef, already you didn't have mumkin in Eretz Yisrael, and that's what Rav Yosef meant in his response to Abaye. That was built in the shlichus sayo de kamaika of dinan. But either way, whether it was built in or whether it's only an innovation of Tosfos, that would be the principle. But clearly, the indication is that there was a need for Bezdin, and then the question is, as we know from the Sugya and Baba Kama, we only say the principle of shlichus sayo when we have a milsa the shchicha v'yesh b'chisar and kiss. The Gemara indicates that no, this is a case of milsa the shchicha. How is it a milsa the shchicha? So Rashi says in the same way that a hova is considered to be a milsa the shchicha, so to get is considered to be milsa the shchicha. So first of all, we have to ask, what kind of a din is shlichusayo? There's a question amongst the Rishonim, which is discussed in the very first Nesivos HaMishpah and Choshe Mishpah, as to whether shlichusayo is a din d'oraisa, whether it's a din d'Rabbanan. You have Ramban Ritva that indicate that it's a din d'Rabbanan. If it's a Ramban Rashba, if it's only a din d'Rabbanan, so how is it going to help if you need a husband to give a get and you beat him up to give a get as a bezdin, but your shlichusayo ability to do so is only a d'Rabbanan shlichusayo? So then on a d'oraisa level, it might be considered to be a coerced get, and the woman would not be divorced. So what are we going to say? At a d'Rabbanan level, it's good enough. How is that going to work on a d'oraisa level? So the Nesivos HaMishpah asked this kasha, and it's one of his Bam Kashas that leads him to the conclusion that shlichusayo actually works on a d'oraisa level. But the Ramban, who says otherwise, gives a different answer, that this is a case when we're relying on shlichusayo for the compelling of a husband to give a get. We really are invoking the principle, shockingly enough, of Afkinam Rabbanan L'Kiddushin Minei. That would be an actual hafkah. The hafkah is going to not cause us to eradicate the entire marriage without a get, because you need to have, as the Rashba says, a get koldahu. Whenever you're going to invoke Afkinam Rabbanan L'Kiddushin Minei, you only have a get koldahu because we've beaten up the husband to give his wife a get. But the Gemara is very clear that kafia itself, when we have cases of kafia, which do come up nowadays in various forms, whether we would authorize monetary kafia, always the question of get law number 2, right? If get law number 2, according to Rav Elyashiv, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, caused kafia, you ever have cases where Bezdin will say, well, this is a case of kofin, where we can really force the husband to give a get, and we don't have the ability to use cattle prods anymore, as Rabbi Shmuel first points out in Chicago. That's why he endorses the halachic prenuptial agreement, because we can't actually beat up the husbands anymore without the rabbis ending up in jail. But certainly when it comes to monetary coercion, we can use the laws that are on the books. So I remember in my early days in the Bezdin being involved in a case in Queens, actually, where there was a recalcitrant husband, and the Rabbanim of Queens came to the determination that based on whatever it was the husband did, that he fell into one of the kafia categories, and therefore the wife would be authorized to invoke get law number 2, whether the courts would explicitly be aware that they were saying asay mashi svavom lecha or not. It might be a machlokas. We showed him if they're explicitly aware that they're doing that when the Bezdin has ruled that kafia is appropriate, but there was paskin to rely on those. We showed him will say that this would be good enough, even if they're not relying on the letter from the Bezdin, as long as the Bezdin gave the authorization. Clearly, in that case, you need a Bezdin. Because the Gemara says that in order to invoke a kfir, you're going to require a bezdin, and it can't be something which would only come from the courts without a bezdin that would cause it to be a get meusa, even if it was kedin. That's a machlokas Rambam and other rishonim, whether that's a psul d'Rabbanan or a psul d'oraisa, but certainly it would be no good. And certainly you couldn't rely upon Instagram influencers to determine that kfir is going to be appropriate. It's something that really has to come from a bezdin. One of the reasons why we need to have training of dayadim in the Kollel lahara, so that we have a proper bezdin making these determinations, as the Gemara indicates at the end of Gittin. But the second issue that Rashi was addressing is, well, okay, so you need shlichusaya, but do you have those criteria of Number one, milsa de shchicha, and number two, milsa de yesh and kiss. So Rashi said, yeah, well, get is shchiach. So what does he mean by that? What does he mean, get is shchiach? We're not talking about get. We're talking about get musa. We're talking about when coercion is appropriate. So did Rashi mean a get me'useh shchiach, or did he mean, well, since the get is shchiach, so therefore those occasions where a get isoy is going to be warranted fall within the realm of a category of something which is shchiach. That's Pashup Pshat and Rashi, but I don't know exactly why that's good enough. But Rashi indicates that this would be good enough. So it's interesting that even back then in the 11th century, Rashi is saying, when interpreting a Gemara that came even earlier, Rashi was saying, get is shchiach. I mean, in the Orthodox community, the rate of gittin only recently rose to 10% or so, which we would consider to be mir matzoi, based on, admittedly, imperfect data, but that seems to be the general figure that's thrown about. I can assure you that it wasn't even that way when I was a child. It was clearly much less than 10%. I would imagine the days of Rashi and the days of the Gemara was less than 10% as well. So it seems that whatever's the criteria for shchiach might be a different criteria for even how we would define mira matzah. It means that it's something that comes up from time to time. And if it's shchiach, that you would have at least one in every generation, at least one in every community. And if you didn't have mechanisms to deal with it, so you're going to be in trouble. So you can say that. But if a bezdin is only needed for get meuseh cases, so we don't have a raya from this Gemara. In fact, we might have a raya for get from this Gemara that a bezdin is required in every single get case, because otherwise, as the get mekusher notes, quoted by the Piskei Tshuva as well in his rather extensive discussions of this issue, you'll see in the source materials a lot of Piskei Tshuvas. Piskei Tshuva and Hilchos Gittin in general is a very entertaining work. He did a great job. Of Avram Tzvi Eisenstadt, who was a great Talmid Chacham in the 19th century. And his Piskei Tshuva works, the Even Ezer Chelik was published during his lifetime, but late in his lifetime, he only lived for 56 years. It was published probably when he was around 50 years old or so. Kosher Mishpat was only published after his lifetime. Yeridei was published like when he was in his 20s. And he never wrote an Orach Chaim, because Orach Chaim, the Piskei Tshuva that we have, was written by somebody else much later. That's why you have Sfarim there that do not appear in the Piskei Tshuva that we have. But his work throughout Hilchos Gittin and the Seder Get of Yuspa, Michal Yuspa, unbelievable works, and he's an invaluable resource. But anyway, one of the arguments that he quotes that you find in the Get Mekusher is that this seems to be a pretty good raya, not that Bezdin requires, not that Get requires Bezdin, but the Get doesn't require Bezdin, because it's only in the context of Get Meusa that we seem to require Bezdin. So this is a question. And we have to revisit that. We have to revisit that question as we go along, because there's a chakira that I would throw out there, and I have not really seen anyone else raise this chakira, but it goes back to what does Rashi mean? Meaning that if Rashi is talking about how get in general is shchiach, and that's why we consider get meusa to be shchiach, it could be that Rashi's hinting at something else, but again, it's not at all Pashup Pshat in the Gemara. And as I pointed out, the Get Mekusher reads an opposite reference in the Gemara, as is noted by the Piskei Tshuva as well, which is that maybe since a get is not going to be kosher if it's a get meusa, unless I have a bezdin that determined that it's being done properly. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that I need a bezdin to give their rubber stamp on a get meusa. Because again, Musa is puzzle. It's puzzle min Torah, as the Rambam writes. That the husband has to make a voluntary decision to divorce his wife. Otherwise, the get is no good. Otherwise, a forced get is no good. So it's not like, oh, I put a bezin into the picture, now a forced get is good. No, it's because the bezin makes the determination or creates a mitzvah shema divrei chachamim situation, which enables the get to be considered to be a voluntary get. So maybe part of the idea is that you always, on some level, need a determination by a bezdin that it is beratzon. And maybe that's part of the idea. Now, of course, not Pashut Pshat in the Gemara. Nobody else that I've seen has raised this question. It's Chakira, but we have Shalom Beis Medrash V'lo Chidush, so I'm just throwing out that possibility. Now, the Beis Yosef in a Siman Aleph of Choshen Mishpah notes that the Gemara in Bava Kama is very exact. When we talk about applying Shlichus Sayo, I need two things. I need, number one, that it's a milsa the shlicha, and number two, it has to be a milsa the yeshba chisaron kiss. So he says, where exactly is the chisaron kiss? So you'd say, what kind of a kasha? Come on, how exactly you have to be? He said, no, the Beis Yosef considers it to be a kasha, so that's legitimate. I can talk about that, right? So you look at source 3, it says, doesn't mention chisaron kiss. And we said chisaron kiss is important. He says, Yesh Lomar, the dine gittin adipa mehechadika chisaron kiss. Now, of course, you need chisaron kiss. I could say the gittin is better than chisaron kiss, and that's similar to the answer that the Ryan gives as to why when Makabel Gerim Bisman is in, we apply seemingly the principle of Shlichus Sayo, assuming you would need to apply the principle of Shlichus Sayo, or do we just apply the fact that the pasuk says the Doro Sechem, but assuming that you would need to apply the Shlichus Sayo with respect to Gittin, so the Ryan says the Hainu Taima to Makabel Gerim Bisman is I've got lo shchiach, even though it's not shchiach. So he says lahaknis adam tachas kain v'yashkina adam b'mona de shchiach, because it's such a big deal in order to be able to bring people under the wings of the Shekhinah. So that's even more important than Shchiach, excuse me. The Shekhinah is even more important than Shchiach. But so by the same token, says the Beis Yosef that in Achinami, that you require a chisaron kiss, and the explanation of chisaron kiss is that mishum aguna, because of the fact that we are resolving aguna situations, that is considered to be a more important consideration than a chisaron kiss, the loss of a woman's ability to be married. So that's considered to be as good or even better than the consideration of a chisaron kiss. The Ramban addresses the question himself in his Chidushim and Sanhedrin, Daf Chav Gimel Amud Aleph, and he says that since we're making a comparison in the Gemara between Hodos v'Hovos on the one hand and Gittin on the other hand, Midi Dahaba Ahodos v'Hovos, right? That was Yosef's response. He's doing Shlikosai just like Hodos v'Hovos. So what was the consideration when it came to Hodos v'Hovos? It's mentioned in the Gemara. So the Gemara says that there would be Nilas Delis. If you would require Mumchin, so then there'd be a Nilas Delis with Neiloba, and lenders wouldn't want to lend because they'd be afraid that it would be hard to find Mumchin, where they would need to collect the money, and therefore they wouldn't loan in the first place. So the Ramban says that there is a similar type of consideration with respect to Gittin. Take a look at the top of page 2 in the materials. He says, V'isoy de Gittin Hodas v'Helbosu. It's also in that same category because there's a monetary element to it. There's a monetary element because money is going to be collected by the woman. The kevin the shchicha, because it's something which is shchiach. The ika ksuba the mishkan, she's going to be collecting her ksuba. Now I would think she's going to be collecting her ksuba even in a case where it's not isoy, but he's saying no. You have to start off with the fact: do I need a bezdin? And once I need a bezdin, do I say shlikusai? So I only need a bezdin if it's isoy. Then do I say shlikusai? Yes, because there's a monetary component. The ika ksuba the mishkan kedini mamanos damya. Then it's already in the category of dini mamanos. It's like hodos velbos, and therefore once we've already substantiated shlikusai by hodos velbos, kadesh l'tino hodos with neilomin, so we would say exactly the same thing with respect to Gittin, because it's essentially an extension of that. Now, there's a sefer that's quoted by Tzvi Gartner. Tzvi Gartner wrote a seminal sefer on Kefiyah Begittin. It's called Kefiyah Beget. It's a great, great sefer. I assume it's somewhere behind me in our library. Mordechai, we have Kefiyah Beget, probably somewhere there. So Rav Gartner quotes in his sefer, the sefer Zek Ksav Yodi. That's the name of the sefer. Sefer Zek Ksav Yodi. Okay, I mean, that's kind of like a cute name for a sefer. Person couldn't figure out. What am I going to call this sefer? This sefer Zek Ksav Yodi. Which wait a second. Hey, I got it. Okay, so that's what the sefer is called. I'm sorry? Might be what, the Kfiyah Beget? Okay, good. So he says that you don't want to that there is Nilas Delos, that the comparison to Hodas Valvos is Nilas Delos, but it's not just that we're saying it's in the realm of Hodas Valvos because the woman's going to collect a ksuba, and therefore whatever svara we applied to Hodas Valvos is going to extend to get. Somebody says the svara itself of Kadesh Lotino Delos Bifnei Lovin applies to get as well, that women Kadesh Latino Delis, that husbands are not going to find wives to marry. The women will not want to get married if we would not have the possibility of Isoi. If they would not know that they have the possibility of getting out of the marriage, if the marriage should be really lousy and the husband should refuse to give a get, that they should have the ability that a bezdin is going to compel the get, so then they're not going to want to get married in the first place. That's a very fascinating statement, and it's one also worthy of consideration. And when the situation warrants kefiyah, we have to make sure that we have the mechanism to bring about proper kfiyah in those situations, whatever mechanisms we need to harness for that purpose. That seems to be also in the equation according to this explanation. Now, Rabbi Gardner relates this whole discussion that is explicit in the Gemara. Nobody can deny what the Gemara says. The Gemara at the end of Gittin clearly indicates that we require dayanim, and the question as to how we can get away without having mumchin, bisman ezeh, when it comes to Isoy get situations, when it comes to coerced get situations, because we actually have a machlokes between the Ksos and the Nesivos. At the beginning of Chol Shemishpat, right? The Ksos at the beginning of Siman Gimel, and Chol Shemishpat has a proposition which he bases on the Tosfos at the beginning of Sanhedrin, Beis Amud Beis, where Tosfos says, why do I need two different psukim that indicate that I have a requirement for a mumchen? One is Elokim Kasav Beparsha, that it says the word Elokim. Sometimes pronounced Bekodesh, sometimes pronounced Bechol, depending on which pasuk we're talking about. So I'll just pronounce it Kekodesh, Elokim, that it says Elokim in the parsha. And number two, it says Lifnehem. So why do I need two psukim? So he says that Elokim shows me that as a general matter, Dine Mamanus requires Dayanim Mumchin. And then there's a question, maybe for certain matters, it doesn't really require three Dayanim, only one, and maybe Hodos, maybe Behodos Velvos. Really, Hadyotos would be good even Minatorah. And we really, according to Rambam, passing like Rabbi Yacha, that even one dayan is going to suffice. But I need a second pasuk of Lifnehem with respect to Mili de Kafia. That's what Toso says. And the Tzo says something very interesting. He says, if I only had Elokim, so then for certain matters, I might say, I need a bezdin, but I could have one person. I could have Hedyotos, Hodos, Vehelbos. But if it's Kfiyah, so for sure, I require a bezdin shel mumchin. And that's why I need both of these psukim. So that's why in this sugya is so important to Abaye that he said, even if you're going to be mekel, the Hodos Vehelbos, not to require mumchin, certainly when it comes to Gem Meusa, we really require a mumchen, and Rav Yosef had to answer that we're going to apply shlichus sayo to this case. So the Ketzo says, based on that Tosfos, that whenever you have a mili de kefiyah, it's always going to require a bez, and the Nesivos has all kinds of different rayos, especially from the case of Nirtz in the Gemara, where you have a master, an Adon, has an Eved Ivri, wants to stay on until the Yovel, and then when it comes to Yovel, he still doesn't want to leave. So the master could take the law into his own hands and beat him up in order to tell him, you got to get out of here. So he could take the law into his own hands. You see, I don't require a bezdin for that. So it's a kasha that is asked by the Nesivos against the Shita of the Ksos, and the Ksos in his Mishovev Nesivos, when he's giving various responses to some of the kashas of the Nesivos. This is all brought by Rav Gartner in his Sefer. So he brings a raya. He brings a raya from our case that you need a bezdin for any kind of isoy. Here it's a mitzvah for the husband to give a get, in whatever the circumstances are, there would be a mitzvah, and we see that we require a bezdin in order to carry out the kfiyah, Why is it that we don't require a bezdin in the case of a nirtza? Because the case of a nirtza is not simply to be kofar mitzvah, but rather it is lahafrisha mi'isr, so that could be done by anybody. So the Imre Bina says that the Imre Bina, of course, is Rav Meir Auerbach. So he says that the raya from get that was bought by the Ksos is not such a solid raya. It can't be such a solid raya because obviously Nasivas has to agree with what the Gemara says that require a bezdin over here. So he must have taken it into consideration. So he says that you need to understand that we draw a distinction between transactions that are considered to be free will. That there's a tayu v'zavin zvine, right? The din of Rafunim Bababasa, that if you compel a seller to sell an item and you give him the right amount of money, we say that he sold it of his own free will, of his own volition, is considered to be a valid sale, as opposed to tayu v'yavin. If you put a lot of pressure on somebody to give away a gift, so then we say that it's not automatically a good gift if we know that he only gave it because of the pressure. So that's considered to be tayu v'yav. And therefore, I need a bezdin, not just to justify the kfiyah, but because of the fact that this is not a tayu v'zavin situation, because the husband isn't getting anything in return for giving the get. The wife might get a ksuba, but what is he going to get? He's not getting anything in return for the get. So therefore, I still am going to have the problem, which is specific to Hilchos Gittin, which is that I can't have a get, which is a coerced get. It's going to be an invalid get. I need to turn it into baratzon. So how am I going to turn it into baratzon? So that's why I need the bezdin precisely to inject the factor of mitzvah lishma divrei chachamim. Once I inject that factor, in fact, that's what the Rambam in Hilchos Gerushin Perek Beis Halacha Chaf says explicitly, that this is why when we do beat up a husband in appropriate cases, it's considered to be given willingly because of that idea of mitzvah lishma divrei chachamim. So even if normally you don't need a bezdin to be kofar ala mitzvos, this case explains the Imre Bina is going to be different based upon this consideration. Very, very fascinating. Now, would the bezdin be needed only for the isoy, or would the bezdin be needed for the entire get? Maybe I could say, okay, this doesn't even demonstrate that in this particular case I need a bezdin for the get. Maybe I just need a bezdin for what happens an hour before the get is given. Husband is taken into a dark room, and they do whatever they need to do. And then the husband shows up to the door of the bezdin an hour later, and not the bezdin. He shows up to the door, I should say, at the Masada get an hour later. The bezdin did their job in the dark room of doing the kafiyah, and now maybe I don't need a bezdin for the get itself. So maybe that's the idea of what Rashi meant when he said v'chein get. V'chein get means that once it could be Rashi's talking about all gittin, as I suggested, although it's dochak, but certainly it's not as dochak to say the Rashi means that when there is a case where I need a bezdin for the isoy, I'm also going to need a bezdin for the entire get. The Piskei Tshuva quotes this in the name of the Re'im, Rabbi Eliyahu Mizrahi, who brings a raya from Gerus, because the Gemara in Yevamos says, how do I know that Gerus requires a bezdin of 3 dayanim? Because mishpach sivbe. Where's the mishpach sivbe? Mishpach yelachem b'lager. Pasuk refers to mishpat in connection with a ger. It could mean that if a ger has a court case, that you should make sure to have a regular bezdin. The pasuk isn't referring specifically to any particular act of gerus that's performed, but Rashi says on that, since mishpach sivbe, high taima. That's why we can't do a gerus, a tevila of a ger b'layla, says Rashi. So clearly says the Reim that we see that whenever we have any kind of a matter in which there is the requirement for a bezdin for any aspect of it, it means that we require that it all goes together, that the entire procedure is going to require a bezdin, and therefore once the Gemara in Gittin establishes that for Isoy, the Maisa of Isoy requires a bezdin, it means that the entire Maisa get that goes together with that Isoy is also going to require a bezdin. There's an article that I found by Rabbi Shlomo Eisenstein. Rabbi Shlomo Eisenstein. Does anybody know who that is? Rabbi Shlomo Eisenstein. Okay, Rabbi Shlomo Eisenstein wrote a series of articles for a periodical called Tvunos Ari in the 1990s. From like Tufshin Shin Nun to Tufshin Nun Hey, has a whole bunch of articles. I cannot find any information about him afterwards. He is referred to as Shlomo Eisenstein Shlita. I don't know. He's a Rosh Yeshiva. I have no idea. Any information would be appreciated, but he wrote a very, very nice article in the Tvunos Ari journal, and I don't know what's happened to him since then. But in that article, he makes the argument that since we do have at least a very strong, solid foundation and basis for the presence of a bezdin whenever it is mamash again meuseh, he says that it would seem that if you did not have a bezdin, and that there was an Isoi case, even if the Isoi would otherwise be justified according to halacha, the get would be no good. And similarly, since what goes hand in hand, as we will discuss in a second, with the need for a bezdin might very well also be the need that a Maisa bezdin has to be bayom as opposed to balayla. If a get meuseh happens to be carried out balayla, even if it would be carried out by a bezdin, he says that would also be null and void. That is a big chiddush. That's a big chiddush. But because it could be that in these get meusa cases, maybe when you get a hold of the husband, it's going to be nighttime. But he says, Bizman hazeh halacha l'maisa, he makes his case that we should say that since it requires a Maisa Bezdin, therefore it has to also be during the daytime whenever you have a get meusa. So let's turn to our regular get situation. So the Ramah in Siman Kaf Chav Gimel in Sifhei quotes from the Mari Mintz. The Mari Mintz is not the only one. This is also the Trumas Hadeshin, and it originated with the Or Zarua, quoted by the Re'im. Doesn't necessarily seem like so many people necessarily read the Or Zarua in the original inside, but the Re'im quotes the Or Zarua at great length, and the Ramah says, Ve'ein L'garish B'layla, just out of the blue, Ein L'garish B'layla, you will not find a Gemara that has any discussion amongst the Amoraim, Tanaim, Amoraim, anybody about whether or not you can be Megarish Balayla, but no, just throws that in, Me'in Megarish Balayla. That's a big deal because there are only 24 hours in the day, and often at least 12 of those hours are Balayla. And sometimes it's hard to find time to do Gittin during the daytime. People are very busy during the daytime. Henkin famously would be very busy during the daytime working with Ezra Satorah, and he only had time to do Gittin when it was nighttime. So Rav Henkin did Gittin at nighttime. But
Moshe did, and Rosh told his father did too.
Everybody did, or certainly in America, it was very, very common. Rav Moshe did, and Rav Natzah Greenblatt did, but the Ramah starts off by saying, don't. Says Ve'ein L'garish B'layla. Don't do Garish and B'layla. Garish B'layla, but then he goes even further, quoting the Remiments, and he says, Garish B'layla Yeshom and get puzzle. Some say that the get is a no good altogether. That is a very, very radical statement. That the get is no good altogether. So why would we make that statement that the get is no good altogether? So it would seem that we're drawing an equation between get and din. I understand the get Musa case, like Shlomo Eisenstein said, but in every single case, that we're going to say that doing a get is like a din. It's like a full-fledged court hearing, a full-fledged bezdin hearing, and therefore it has to be during the daytime. It would follow that you would probably also need a bezdin as well, if that's the explanation. So maybe getting back to what the Ramban said in a get Meusa situation, that there's always a ksuva ramification when a get is going to be given. Would seem not only a get Meusa, whenever it gets given, there's a ksuva ramification. So then once it's in the realm of mamanos, so it makes sense that we might assume that this would fall into the ambit of the bezdin proceeding that requires a bezdin, and this appears also, although it's not in Siman Kov Chav Gimel in the Mechaber, but it makes its way into the Mechaber in terms of the Seder Aget. When the Mechaber is writing down the Seder Aget, in the materials here. It's not until source 24, so it's way down in the materials, but we'll refer to it because it's irrelevant at this point in time. This is in Sif Peiches, the Peites of the Seder Aget. So the Machaber says, Nesina Saget, Yesh Mi Sheomer Shetzarech Lios B'Yom Lo B'Layla. That there is somebody who says that it has to be during the daytime and not at night. And then he goes on the next line. He says, "Im lo b'shas hatchak, she'az apilu b'layla mamash yikasev v'inasein." So the way in which it's codified in the Seder Aget is that in the event that there is a shas hatchak situation, so then for sure there would be room to be makel to do it b'layla. So and we don't have any conflicting view brought over here. The Ramah doesn't bring anything, so it would seem that the bottom line is that even though Yesh Omim, Dari get puzzle, we're not really going to puzzle it in the final analysis. So maybe it's not so terrible, at least when you're not dealing with a get meusa situation. Maybe get meusa, as we said, could be worse, just like a get that is delivered by a shliach, as we will discuss, could also be worse because you need a bezdin to be present when the person says we're finding nectar, finding nectar. So the Beis Shmuel in Siman Kaf Chav Gimel already notes that there is a discussion that the Machaber has, not in the Shulchan Aruch, but in the Beis Yosef about this issue, where he does cast very serious doubts upon this stringency, and he says, "Eini yodea tam ledin zeh." That's a very strong statement. When the Beis Yosef says "Eini yodea tam ledin zeh," he doesn't simply mean I was out from yeshiva that day when it was discussed. He means through my exhaustive study of Kol Torah Kula, I can't come up with a good explanation as to why somebody should have this chumrah. And then he suggests, v'yeshomim mishum zahavi din. Ain't done in Balayla, maybe because it's considered to be din, and we have a principle ain't done in Balayla. For his sigal tamzeh, somebody was his sigal tamzeh. This isn't in the Beis Yosef. Tahamadze likach schar misidr aget mishum delav dinhu. That after all, we do allow for a schar from the siddur aget that's also encapsulated and codified in the Seder Aget, where the Seder Aget says that we don't paskin, like the Bartanura, that it would be impermissible for the Mesader Gittin to take money for the Seder Aget. That's in source 22, Seder Aget Siv Dalid, right? Where the Machaber there quotes, V'arav B'beinu Avadia B'ferish Mishnah, the Bechoros Kara Tugger, all of a bottom Mesader Aget, a notely noter Mechtei Schar Batola, that they receive more than, did I say Schar Tircha? I guess I should say Schar Batola. And it says the Ramah, V'lo Nagu Kimoso, Gam Tamo Eno Klum, and the Ramah also takes strong exception to this chumrah of the Bartanura, because the Bartanura assumes that there's some sort of a din taking place over here, and says the Ramah, nah, Ve'eno Rayak, Siddur Aget Eno Din. Siddur Aget Eno Din. It's not a din. It's just the purposes of going through a learning process when you're being Messiah the get. Maybe he's distinguishing between taking a schar for the Siddur Aget as opposed to the Nesinas Aget. Maybe more problematic, but certainly on its face, it sounds like we're not viewing it altogether as a din. And that's basically the conclusion, because the Machaber who rejected it in Siman in the Seder Aget, where or at least the Machaber quoted the Bartanura, but he just quoted it in terms of the Yesh Omim over here. If you take a look at the beginning of that source, if they're taking too much schar, Yesh Omim should sark shlo yoedim krovim lohem. So the way he says it is, well, in such a case, so then the Eidim should not be karov to the Sofer of the Chacham, that we should prevent them from, we should apply the rules that they can't all form together as a Bezdin. So he quotes it again as a Yesh Omim, and the Ramah says that the Ramah who is Machmir in Siman Kov Chav Gimel, at least not he says Ve'ein Legarish B'Layla and Yesh Omen Du Pasol, says that it's not a din altogether, but a limud bi'alma. And it sounds like he's going back on what the Mechaber was referring to in terms of there not being krovim for the process of the get doesn't distinguish between the Seder and the Nesina. But it could be that the reason the Ramah brings in Shulchan Aruch is out of deference and respect to the fact that the Or Zarua said this and the Mari Min says this, and then the Ramah himself in the Darchei Moshe, who says that I can't find the basis to be machmir based on this being a din, throws in another consideration, or at least take a look in source 23 in the Piskei Tshuva. The Piskei Tshuva says, let me just find where I flagged this in the Piskei Tshuva. It's a very, very long quotation from the Seder Aget, Seder Aget Sif Dalid. So he says, this is at the end of the very first paragraph, where he says, Eino din elo limud. Basically, on what we just quoted from the Seder Aget. So he says, L'chora kasher, because in Siman Kov Chav Gimel, Sasam Ramah she'ein legarish b'layla, shafilu b'di'evid yeshom shall get pasul. Barei ein shum tamas zerak mishum dahavi kamodin. The only basis for this would be that it's a din. So why over here is the Ramah saying that it's clearly not a din? So he says, take a look in the Beis Shmuel. So he says in the Beis Shmuel, separate Beis Shmuel, near the Taris, the emes das Ramah de eno din. That in reality, the Ramah holds that it's not a din. But nonetheless, since the Truma Sedeshin was machmir, so he was machmir. B'shem kama poskim, ulai mihu mitam acher, because maybe it's mitam acher. What is the tam acher? So that is a question and mystery that still has not been resolved. What is the tam acher? That we would say that it could not be balayla other than the fact that it is considered to be kedin. So we don't know what the tam acher is. Maybe the tam acher is that what goes there are two cases of get meuseh. What goes there are two cases of a get ayidei shliach. I don't know. What is the Or Zarua? Have to say, where did he get this idea from? It seems to be so clearly against pretty much everything, all of the basic sources. There's a Tosas in Sanhedrin and Daf Mem Dal and Amud Aleph talks about you hear a disembodied voice that is authorizing for a get to be written for a person who the disembodied voice claims to be. So there's a question, maybe I have to worry that it's really a demon, it's a shade, it's not a real person, the discussion in the Gemara. So says Tosfos, that's only if it's in the Sadeh or the Harim, the fields and the mountains of Abiyir, the night, but if it's in the city, I don't have to worry. Even at nighttime, I don't have to worry. Because if not, actually, the case there is talking about some other context, not a get. But he says that if I wouldn't be makel to not worry about demons in the city, so how could people say hello to each other? And how could a woman be divorced balayla? So Tosfos clearly seems to be assuming that a woman can be divorced balayla. That's what the Rashash says. The Rashash says on that Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Mem Daled Amud Aleph. So the Rashash says, Mevuad Lokidas or Zarua. Says that we have a clear proof from this Tosfos, not like the Or Zarua, which is Muva Benoda B'Yehuda, which we'll get to. We're brought in the Tshuva and the Noda B'Yehuda popularized the Or Zarua. Sheposa and Nesidas Get Balayla, who prohibited and invalidated a get which is delivered at night. Furthermore, we have the Gemara in Gittin, Daf Ayin Vav and Beis. Abaye says, "Hakomodim echad amal shteitzi tachama min artika l'knafka kamala." a man gives a get and he says when the sun comes out of its sheath, when it's going to rise in the morning, so that's when the get will be valid. It doesn't become valid until then. The chimayas belelia have a get la'achamisa, in which case the get is not valid if he dies in the middle of the nighttime. But if he says amanas shetesi chaminatika, so he means from now the get is going to be valid. To me akshav kamola, so when the sun comes out, the divorce is going to be effective from when he said it, even if he dies in the middle of the night. In Rashi, when talking about this case of the man who says that the get will be effective if or when the sun comes out in the morning, Rashi says, "Be'omer liishto b'layla zeh when a man says to his wife at night, this is your get when the sun comes out, or if the sun comes out minatika from its shita. So we see that Rashi at least understands that the case is where the man is giving a get balayla. And the Gemara doesn't have a problem with the get being given balayla, and there's even a hikitimsa where the get is going to be effective balayla as well. So the Radbaz, if you look at source 11, Nechelek Dalet Siman Pei Dalet, this is an earlier source. The Radbaz, a contemporary of the Beis Yosef, Shulchan Aruch. The Radbaz is a tshuva, and he says that the opinion of the Or Zarua is very difficult. So the Shtamil Chad Me'atanami Ma'amarayim and Bali Alakos Me'aposkim Shana Regilaman Lashmin Din Zeh Shel Kiddush Gadol. We don't find it anywhere. Not in the Tanaim, not in the Amoraim. This is a Kiddush Gadol. The Chayeged the Pligi B'Chalitza B'Layla tonight. We have a machlokas tanaim as to whether a chalitza b'layla is good. Is it considered to be techilas din, which will be no good? Is it considered to be soap din, which is good? So amaylo fligu beget kimin l'chataymaninu. Why don't they also argue with respect to a get, since it's after all would be the same consideration? Is it considered to be techilas din? In which case we say biyom manchilo espanav, it must be during the daytime. Is it considered to be the soap din? In which case the Gemara says we apply the pasuk dem and shaftu asam mecholes. In which case it would be good, but we don't find the discussion altogether in the Gemara. Then he says a couple of lines down, Shurisi ben Mordechai. The Mordechai says with Shem Ari Me Orleans that Abagash Shlich Nosen Geb Pnei Shlosha Mishum the Dami Lemishpa. Even in a case of a shliach, where we say that it has to be given in front of 3 dayanim because of the fine nectar, even then we're going to be meko to allow it in the nighttime. That's not a shita which is accepted la halacha. Get Pashut has a lengthy discussion about this. He says, no, we're not making like that. In Simon Kov Chav Gimel, Apilu Haki, I think Sivkat and Chav Aleph. Apilu Haki came in the Kim Shtaras to Rabbanim. Yachalit no Balayla, Vlodami the Kim Shtaras the Alma. Whoever heard this one that you could be meko even b'di'evid to give over a get a Balayla, even through a shliach. The Tchila Balhaka Sofdinu, he says that it's considered to be Sofdin. That's also quoted, by the way, from Rashi. If you take a look at Agos Mordechai in source 13, in Maseches Gittin Tav Samak Zayin, he quotes the similar Maisa b'mei Rashi. There was a mumar labodas kachavim shnisratzos to get liishto, that you've had this mumar, you have to worry about an apostate, maybe you'll never find him again. He finally agrees to give a get to his wife. V'hora Rashi la'acher l'kabla get shalomidaita, and Rashi said that the wife wasn't around, let somebody else accept it on her behalf. Even though the shliach is, or maybe he meant to give it to a shliach laholach who's then going to deliver it. He says even though the shliach is giving the get b'fnei shlosha mishum the dami the mishpat, but the truth is, even if he was given, it says that to the husband was going to appoint a shliach to deliver the get. Afilu given the kiyum shtaras to a banan yachol lidno balayla, could still be given balayla below dami the kiyum shtaras the alma that's clear dinu v'haka sofdinu. A similar discussion. It's saying that it's considered to be sofdin. It's the end of the process when a get is given, and we find even a kula with respect to giving a get ayidei shliach balayla. So certainly a regular get, he says for sure, could be given balayla. And he also brings the proof from the fact that the Gemara has a discussion of nichta b'yom nechtam balayla, is that kosher or not? And it would seem that even the Gemara should have said that even if a get is nichta v'nechtam b'yom, it's going to be no good if it was nitam balay, if it was given balayla. So from all of these cases, he brings a raya against the Or Zarua. But at the end of this whole discussion, he says, "Umikol makom yesh lachosh," but nonetheless, we should be concerned. Kevin sheyatzim pi bal sefer Or Zarua. Let's start lasos. But that since the sefer Or Zarua said this, so we have to be careful about giving a get balayla. When he says careful about giving a get balayla, he doesn't mean you can't give a get b'layla. He just means if you did it b'layla, do it very quietly. And let's start lasos b'tzina. Do it quietly. Shalotzi las legitin arishonim. Or he means that if we're going to be machmir about it, we should be machmir quietly. It's probably a better pshat. So when I have a case of a get b'layla, I don't say that you're not allowed to do a get b'layla because I don't want to be motzi las on the gittin that were given b'layla. Rather, rather I find some sort of an excuse in order to put it off until the next day, but I don't say that it's absolutely invalid because it is very, very difficult to say it is invalid. And the continuation of the Radbais, he quotes others, he quotes the Radbais quotes a Ma'akash, who says that he did it get many times a night, and there was nobody who was potsepeh. So there is certainly so the Radbaz certainly indicates that this is not etched in stone. The one needs to really be machmir. It's just that since the Orzavur said it, so we try to accommodate a shita, even though we don't really understand where it is, where it comes from. Even more interestingly is that the Be'er Heitev in Siman Chavav really brings all of the kashas, all of the oppositions to that's in you look in source 11 to the shita of the Or Zarua. And he says Isha Hainu look at Belayla. Hainu she'ein nosnim aget Belayla. A kos of kosim chosmim Belayla. You could write it for sure. And then he says, he quotes the Beis Yosef and Yodea Tam Ladin Zeh, and some say it's Kedin, but it's like a din, but it's not really like a din. And then he says, "V'chein pasuk Beis Yosef l'kaman simen kuf nedalid to b'shas hadchak apil b'layla mamish yikasiv v'yinasein." Then the Mahalchash b'tshuva maybe says hitir b'pshitus b'shas hadchak, says that for sure the get is allowed to be delivered b'layla b'shas hadchak. And he quotes the Radbaz, so he clearly does not hold by this. The Or Zarua himself said, "Well, I know that the get is no good b'layla, but since I have a hekesh v'yotzav v'haisa between gittin and kiddushin, maybe it's a suffix whether we should allow kiddushin to take place b'layla as well." So the Be'er Heitev, when it comes to the main source, gittin, says that the Or Zarua doesn't make any sense. But when it comes to kiddushin in Siman Chavav of Eben Ezer, he says Isha shiniskat shabalayla safek imhem kiddushin. That and because of Knesset Gedolu Poa Yamina Gabul Kadesh B'Layla V'Talti Yamina, I got rid of this minhag V'Talti Yamina, got rid of the minhag to be Mekadesh B'Layla. What in the world is going on over here? This is the classic case of Yatziva Be'ara V'Giora B'Shmei D'Shmaya, where the main source of the Or Zarua, the Be'er Heitev says there's no basis, and then the extension of his chiddush to kiddushin, which is a questionable extension, that the Be'er Heitev accepts hook, line, and sinker. So the Piskei Tshuva notes that in source 12 and Even Ezer Siman Chavav notes the irony of the contradiction in the Or Zarua in the Be'er Heitev about this, and he says that even if there would have been room to be machmir to number one like the Or Zarua, and number two to extend it to the case of kiddushin, it will only be based on v'yotzav v'haisa. V'yotzav v'haisa is only with respect to how it is that a get is effectuated, which is b'shtar, so it'll only be with respect to kiddushay shtar. In recent years, there have been some innovators who wanted to say, hey, let's go back to Kiddushay Shtar. That seems like a fun thing to do. Rav Ezer Batzri writes in his Hilchos Ishus, in his Dinei Ishus, that's a very dangerous thing to do because we don't really know how to do the proper writing with a woman's consent and the right lashonos of doing Kiddushay Shtar. So we're very likely to get it wrong. But another reason not to do it is because you might have an argument that at least l'chatchila you shouldn't do kiddushay shtar b'layla, and many weddings take place b'layla. But certainly kiddushay kesef says that the Piskei Tshuva is nothing to be worried about. So, how did this translate into the idea of needing bezdin for a get? So the one who translated it into all of this is the Noda B'Yehuda. The Noda B'Yehuda tries to analyze where in the world did the Or Zarua get his idea from. and he struggles with it. This is in Ibn Ezer, Siman Kuf Yud Dalet, and he says maybe the Or Zarua was just talking about a get ayidei shliach, and then I get because you guys say fanektam, so that I understand. And if he didn't, and if he gave it balayla, where he can't properly do a kiyam shtar, and we don't assume like the Mordechai that it would be okay b'di'evid, then, or like this Shuvas Rashi, so then what's the halakha? The halakha, some wanted to say you're stuck, you did it wrong, get one chance and you're out. One strike, you're out. We don't paskin that way. We paskin that the shliach can give it to her again the next day, and it'll be perfectly valid. Or you could be Mekayim B'chosmav. You could be Mekayim the Chasimus of the Edom, and it'll be perfectly valid. Actually, the end of the word, he says, maybe that is what the Or Zarua was talking about. However, he says, afterwards, I saw in the Shuvas Re'im that he quoted the Or Zarua, and he said, no, it's even talking about a get miyada liyada, even, and you shouldn't do it balayla because it's like a din, because it's like a chalitza. And another reader says, I have a real hard time with that because we don't really find that we require dayanim with respect to, again, just because of the ksuva. He says the ksuva itself is allowed to be signed during the nighttime. So why would we say because of the ksuva that it has to be during the daytime? He says utamua be'enai. The whole thing is very questionable. Even the comparison to chalitza, if you look in the Aruch HaShulchan, Siman Kov Kov Gimel, he says that would be a very difficult argument because of the emes lo dami the chalitza. Misas ba'ila megaslak subas. In the case of the chalitza, as soon as the chalitza is given, so the ksuba thing has already been resolved, or has already been determined. Because really, when the husband died, that's when the wife was entitled to the ksuba, and then it was just held in abeyance until because maybe the brother-in-law is going to do yibum, and then when the chalitza is done, so it kicks in automatically. However, with the get, the chiyuv ksuba doesn't get off the ground until the get is given, and then it only begins like afterwards. We say, oh, now she's divorced. We have to talk about the ksuva. So therefore, there's not really a perfect analogy. And number two, chalitza requires a bezdin, and with respect to a get, we have a Gemara in Elchin. The Gemara in Elchin says explicitly, "Atu called the megaresh for bezdin megaresh." So do we think that it's talking about a case of somebody, Rafuna, who had an arif with respect to his ksuva, and it was his father who was the arif, and Abaye said that why don't you just go and divorce your wife, and then you should ask for the ksuva. It was I think her father, ask and then collect the ksuva, and then you could take her back and you'll share the proceeds. But the Mishnah in Erchin says that if that is going to be done, then there would have to be a neder, which is taken in order to avoid the kanunya, that the husband is not going to remarry his wife. And the Gemara answers, whoever's going to be Messiah of the get is not going to know this din, and then he'll be able to divorce her and collect the amount, and they'll be able to split the proceeds. But in the end, it turned out he couldn't take advantage of the advice because he was a Kohen anyway. That's the whole story. But in the course of the story, the Gemara says, called the Megarish, Beidin Megarish. So we see that get does not require a bezdin. And it's only, and I don't need the Or Zarua to tell me about the case of a shliach, because of course that's not going to be delivered balayla. But he says that no, since the Or Zarua said it, so we try to be machmir l'chatzchila. Fine. So the Noda Yehuda quoted all of that. Also wasn't so impressed with the comparison to chalitza, but then he says, I have a better raya. What's the better raya than the Or Zarua? And again, he's assuming that if it's going to be a din, so then it should also require a bezdin. So he says, so Rashi says at the beginning of Masechah Sanhedrin, where it says, Mi'un mishlosha, Mi'un requires gimel. Why does Mi'un, when a girl who is married off by her brother or by her brothers, or a girl who is married off by her brothers or her mother, where it's not Kiddushin Daraisa, she could say, I don't want the husband before she becomes a Gedola. So how do we know that procedure of refusing to remain in the marriage has to be done in front of 3 dayanim? So Rashi says, because called the Tikkun Rabbanan, Kein Daraisa Tikkun. So says another Yehuda, what's the Kein Daraisa? That Miyun requires Gimel, just like a Daraisa case would require Gimel. What's akin to Miyun on a Daraisa level? That's Hainu Get. it's obviously a get. So therefore, we see from Rashi it requires 3 dayanim. So this is a basis for the Orzavua. Once it required dayanim, it's a ma'aseh bez, and we understand why it has to be yom and not Balayla. So it's kind of like a stretch to explain the Orzavua why the get has to be given by yom and not Balayla. Explains because it requires a bezdin, and since it requires a bezdin, so that would explain why it absolutely must be also bayom and not a balayla. And he brings the raya from the Rashi, which is sort of amusing in a way, because the Orzavua himself says, well, since I say a get has to be delivered by yom because it's like a din, so why then don't we require 3 dayanim? He says, yeah, because it's just like it's just a mumminess that's like hodos ve'hovos. You could have 1 dayan, so therefore we don't require a full-fledged bezdin. Even 1 dayan would be good enough, and I think he says a hedyo would be good enough. So I guess he's not necessarily saying that you don't require a bezdin. He's saying I certainly don't require 3 dayanim. So yours Arua himself doesn't require 3 dayanim, but the Noda B'Yehuda is sort of bringing a raya from the fact that I need 3 dayanim. The yours Arua must be correct, and he himself doesn't require 3 dayanim. So that part is kind of like the amusing part regarding the Orzavua. But the Noda B'Yehuda, if we go back to the case of Bishliach. So let's back up for a moment to that obvious case. So as we pointed out, not everybody agrees that even that has to necessarily be bayom, but we're certainly machmir as the get. Pashut says that we follow those shitos, that we can't be mekayim if those shach. In the case if the minhag is that you do kiyum shtaros b'layla, then you can do it b'layla because minhag mevatz halacha. The whole thing of kiyum shtaros is only d'rabbanan, but the ma'aseh we're machmir about that. So what if in that particular case you don't get around to giving the get until like it's a little bit after Shkia? So we had a conference of Rabbanim in 2018 in which the Rabbanim was speaking about their various kabbalas and experiences regarding get b'layla, and that's when it was mentioned about Rav Henkin and Rav Moshe and Rav Nata that they all did get in b'layla. But what about get ayidei shliach? So Rav Moshe had a kula that if it's given al yidei shliach, that bein hashmashos, since the whole thing is only the Rabbanan, we're not going to be as machmir regarding bein hashmashos as we would be regarding Laila itself. And he says that if it is a bein hashmashos, and the truth is the Piskei Teshuva and Seder gets a pay test at the very end, that's so the end of source 25 says the same thing, that that's only b'Laila but not bein hashmashos. Hainu dafka b'Laila mamish. It has to be, but the b'Laila mamish. But if it's during the daytime, even though they daven mariv, but pilu kashaya ben hashmashos, and you're not sure if it's a yom Laila, never lahakam malkam igun gadol. Came in the Kama poskim the Mekayim Shtos B'Laila, since there after all are poskim that say you can be Mekayim Shtos B'Laila, and the Sma is makel even to hear cases of Dinei Torah and Simanei and Kol Shemishpat. If you have Neos Dolkim, you have lights that are on, and nowadays we have electric lights that are on, and so forth. So he says Mikomakam Makam Igun Gadol Usafik Laila Shapi Yeshus Mok was there. So Moshe was make up until 25 minutes, according to Rabbi Landisman's account of Rav Moshe, according to Rabbi Lichter's account of Rav Moshe, 20 minutes. But whether 20 minutes or 25 minutes, that's a pretty long time. That's a pretty long time. We once had a case, the first case that I had where this issue came up was a high-profile get where I was appointed as the shliach. I haven't been a shliach yet that many times myself. Usually I'm like a Masada, whatever. But I was the actual shliach, and the get, there was like a lot of holdups because whatever reason, we wanted to see that the husband and wife weren't in the same ear. That has to do with whether the husband claims pikada, like only left us a pikadon. We waited till the wife was no longer in the city. That's a shayla. When does it really matter? When the get is written, when the get is delivered? But in any event, when the get was actually delivered, it was a get delivered. Rabbi Willig's not here, but he would remember it. In the young Israel of Riverdale, what was most memorable about the get was that all the telephones were ringing. I remember in the show, this is before cell phones, but like every single telephone around was ringing, wherever there were telephones. It was just a very wild scene. And we figured out the get was probably delivered about 2 minutes after Shkia. So according to my motion, no problem. 2 minutes after Shkia is within the 20-minute window. Not a problem at all. But we were worried. So we decided to be Mekayim as a get b'chosmav. So yeah, it's a very interesting thing. So the next day or a few days later, we got together and the Eidim, testified about their signatures, and the three Dayanim signed. This is on the very bottom of the get after the Chasimus Eidim. It says, "B'fanenu bezdin chasui mata niskay b'fanenu hani trei sadi," and we gave the names of the Eidim, Vashrudu, V'kaimenu, Kedachazi, Nuum, and that's what a Kiyum Chasimus looks like. Part of it itself, when you have to be Mekayim B'chosma. Since that point in time, I've had maybe 2 other occasions where we had to be Mekayim to get B'chosma. Very fascinating thing. Okay, anyway, getting back to that's in the case where a get is delivered Ayadei Shliach. Now, so getting back to the Noda B'Yehuda, so we mentioned that the Noda B'Yehuda was relying very heavily upon the Rashi, but at the same time, what does the Noda B'Yehuda do with all of the sugyas in the Gemara that indicate that we don't really require a get? We have the Gemara in Echin that says Kol Megare Atu Kol Megarish V'Beidin Megarish. We have also in addition the raya from the case at the end of Maseches Gittin that don't get Meuseh seems to require a bezdin. There's also the Gemara in Kedushin and Daf Samach Beis talks about somebody who wants to convert, where he gives a get, where a person is about to convert and he wants to marry a woman. So he says, here's your Kedushin that will take place as soon as I convert. And we say it's not biyado for him to convert because because who says he's going to find the bezdin to convert him? So therefore, that's not considered to be a davar habal liolam, or sufficiently biyado for him to effectuate the kedushin. But then it has the case of somebody who gives a get to his wife, or who gives kesef kedushin to his wife, and he says after I divorce you, so then this is going to be the kesef kedushin for me to remarry you. So the Gemara says, well, in the heat to be other lagarsha, even though he has the ability to divorce her against the will, he doesn't have the ability to kacha. So then the kasha is, but if I need a bezdin for a get, why don't I say miyema to mizdaki beit klasa? Who says he's going to find the bezdin in order to do the get? So these are the various rayos. So what the Noda B'Yehuda can do with all the different rayos in the Gemara is to say that since he's comparing it to the case of chalitza, because there's mumminus involved in terms of the adjudication of the ksuba, whenever we are going to be, whenever we say that we don't require a bezdin, that must be about an arusa case where she's not entitled to a ksuba, or some other case where the woman was mochelas a ksuba, or she somehow lost the ksuba based on her behavior. So whenever there's no mumminus component, so then that's why I'm not going to require a bezdin. So I could say, okay, if that's the argument of the Noda B'Yehuda, in so many cases where we do get to nowadays, the parties have already, as we've discussed in the past, they've already resolved all their financial differences, right? In many of the cases. So maybe in a case where they've resolved all their financial differences, they really wouldn't even be a chumrah to require a bezdin according to the approach of the Noda B'Yehuda, for whom this entire svara is based upon, because it's not really coming from the Or Zarua, it's really coming from the Noda B'Yehuda, who's making that interpretation of the Or Zarua based on the Rashi at the beginning of Sanhedrin. Furthermore, there are other ways to interpret those. There are other ways that you could answer up those Gemaras if you really wanted to. According to Noda B'Yehuda, you could say the Gemara mi'ema de kol megarish v'beidin megarish means that who says that the person who's going to, that when Rav Huna would do the get, he would go in front of a bezdin and mumchen. Maybe he would go in front of a bezdin shel yotos, meaning who says it's going to be an expert bezdin that would know the rule about not allowing a person to, requiring a man who's going to be collecting a ksuba from an arev to be madir hana from ever remarrying his wife. Maybe it won't be such a knowledgeable bezdin, and that's what Beinu Gershom says. And there's a Rosh who says maybe they're not even going to know that the ksuba has an arev altogether. So, but it doesn't mean that we don't actually require a bezdin. And maybe the Gemara in Kedushin, we could say that when it comes to gerushin, even if a bezdin is required, maybe it's not so hard to find the bezdin that would be readily available. So there are different shitos or terutzim that could potentially obviate those kashas, but lemaise the kashas are better than the terutzim. I think that it's pretty clear. To call the megarish for beidin and megarish, that seems like a pretty difficult hurdle to be able to clear. Furthermore, in terms of the Rashis, that the Rashi at the beginning of Sanhedrin, you could say that even if Rashi is analogizing miyun to some situation, it's not a get. You could say the Chassam Sofer and the Beis Levi and the Piskei Tshuva all quoted, and the Maram Shift all quoted the Rashi could have been referring to. I'm sorry, the Chassam Sofer and the Beis Levi and the Piskei Tshuva, not the Maram Shift. They say Rashi could have been referring to a Gemusa situation, which much more resembles a miyun, because it has to do with unraveling a marriage between husband and wife. And the Aruch HaShulchan, the Maram Shif, and I'm sorry, unraveling a marriage in a way that's Baal Korcha, because just like Miyun is Baal Korcha of the husband, so too Gemeusa is Baal Korcha of the husband. And the Aruch HaShulchan, the Maram Shif, the Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Chaver, and the Rashash say that Rashi could be referencing Chalitza, which is similar to miyun because it also has to do with a refusal, like the me'en yami, that the wife says, my brother-in-law is refusing to do yibum, and here too the girl is refusing to remain married, and there's and also it's something which doesn't have a ksiva, as opposed to a get, which is something which is written, where it's sefer korsa vein davar acher korsa, as the Radbaz says, when it comes to miyun, it's all verbal. So that's like chalitza. Chalitza, it's all verbal. It's not in a writing that the relationship becomes unwound. Okay, and we mentioned the Targum Yonasan that nobody really follows Targum Yonasan. Halacha l'maaseh. Targum Yonasan is mostly good for like a Shal Shudis board, but if it goes against Gemara and Poskim, so we don't follow the Targum Yonasan. And now there was a further spirited discussion when we had that conference 2018 about doing Gittin at night, and the question is how commonplace is that nowadays? Almost every Masadu Gittin I know has had some Shas Atchak situation where we certainly have relied upon doing a get B'layla, and the Tosefes Bikurim quotes from a Afos Re'im, who says that anybody who is a ma'arer against the get that was given B'layla, so we basically put a pax upon him. We prick him with a rabbinic needle, with a mabua, that is going to go in very deep into his skin. So, in other words, it's an accepted halacha that certainly b'shas atchak we do get in b'layla, and Rav Henkin would regularly do it because he held that every single get was a shas atchak or shas igun situation, and even though a different Rav could have done it, so Rabbi Landesman quoted what he heard from Menashe Klein, that Rav Henkin felt that his doing a get B'layla was more of a makom igun justification than having a different Rav do the get during the daytime. So he certainly was makel about that, and Ramosha was makel about that. As a matter of course, certainly Rav Nata was traveling all over the world. If that's the only time the husband's going to do the get, you do the get at that time. We had a case of a husband where after he was a ma'agin his wife for 15 years, and then suddenly he decided he's going to agree to give a get. Maybe it was because in order to get invited to an upcoming wedding of a child, whatever it was, he agreed to give the get, but he agreed at night. And the question was, do we wait until the next day to do the get? So the answer is no, of course, you have to chop him immediately. So he wrote the get b'layla, but then the question is, do you hold the get? Because there are dangers, as we all know, to holding a get, or can you deliver it to the wife the same night? This was like in the middle of 2 a.m. or whatever. So they called me up to ask my advice about it, and I said, have the shliach give the get to the wife, and we mekayim chosma, and that's what we did in those emergency situations. You can not only do the get b'layla, you can even give it ayidei shliach b'layla in those situations. And Rabasri in his sefer also talks about a get he did b'layla with a man who was a shota. He said it was 3 a.m. 3 a.m. This man was not a shota. He was an itim shota itim kola. He was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Sometimes he was in his right state of mind, sometimes he wasn't. When he was in his right state of mind, he said finally that he's prepared to give a get, and they've been struggling for years with this guy, and he was prepared to do it 3 a.m. He was completely coaching, cognizant of everything, coherent, and Basri ran out with the team, to do the get immediately. So that's certainly where we're makel about. What about in terms of requiring Bezdin? Since we saw that the whole thing was based on an Or Zarua, and the Rashi and Sanhedrin, there's so many different ways of interpreting the Rashi and Sanhedrin, and the Or Zarua himself didn't require 3 people for a Bezdin when it came to a get, and writes that explicitly, as quoted by the Re'im. So I saw Rabbi Jackson, I know, gave a Chaburah here last week, so he collected different practices of different Mesadrim that he watched over the years, and he said that the Bati did in Eretz Yisrael, I don't know if he discussed this last week week, probably he said the Bati Din Eretz Yisrael generally makpid about this to always require a Beis Din. I visited once the Beis Din in Tel Aviv with Rabbi Zilberman. We visited by Rabbi Tzvi Ben Yaakov, and we saw that it didn't seem that there was a hakpada per se that there'd be a full-fledged Beis Din, other than the Eidei Masira, obviously, who are present. But it could be that maybe they normally were makpid, but since Rabbi Zilberman and I were there, so he had a Beis Din with us. So I don't know if he normally is makpid to have two other dayanim. I don't know. I wasn't sure.
Right, I have to discuss it all. I spent the Chaburah on Shemos and Makamos. That was the
Right. No, I understood. That was the focus. Yes, Rabbi. Yes, so Mordechai, you wanted to say something?
No, that's safer. Rabbi Sher Haddad, he writes how it's really not right. How it is not having a proper Beis Din for the get. In the old days, in the Bati Din Rabbanim, we used to be makpid. Chaval, we don't go back to that.
That could be. So he did say he saw that Rabbi Waldenberg did two gittin on his own in the Beis Din Agadol B'Yerushalayim. But again, I question what's when he did two gittin on his own, that he saw Rabbi Waldenberg do two gittin on his own. At the very least, he saw Rabbi Waldenberg do two gittin while presumably he was there. He was sitting there, right? So I don't know. It could be that the Or Zarua does. The Or Zarua, if I recall correctly, the Or Zarua says, well, you definitely, of course, need to have, two Eidei Masira, who are present, and Rabbi Jafta writes that his Saklas Rabbanim is machmir about what is brought in the Shulchan Aruch Sim Kuf Lam and Gimel in Sif Gimel, which is that there used to be a practice, and it's even like a recommended thing to have 10 men present, 10 dayanim present for the giving over. Again, that's in order to publicize the fact that the woman is properly divorced. And so, but that practice I don't think is found anywhere nowadays. He says that in his Saklas they were machmir about that in Debrecen. I can tell you in the CRC we always have a Beis Din. That's our practice to always have a Beis Din. When I say a Beis Din, I mean a Beis Din in addition to the Eidei Masira. So we always do have a Beis Din present, but again, that's it's questionable as to how much you have to stand on ceremony about this. And certainly b'shas tzedchak, I don't think that anybody holds that it's considered to be likuva. But there are different reasons that are given other than that of the Noda B'Yehuda. Even if I say that it's not required in Bedin, and so even according to Noda B'Yehuda, how much are we necessarily adjudicating monetary cases in connection with the get? Often it's completely separate or done beforehand. The Ksam Sofer, after citing the Noda B'Yehuda and disagreeing with the need for a get, he does say that it's required for the chakiros that are done by the dayanim. The dayanim are choker, the Edom and the Sofer, to make sure that they did their job properly and signed and wrote the get lishma. And that they did had in mind the husband, the wife, the purpose of divorce, and that they saw everything they needed to see in terms of the husband acquiring the writing materials and giving over the writing materials to the soper, etc., etc., etc. So he says that chakiras edim, that has to be done in the presence of a Beis Din, because that requires a Kabbalah. You have a Haggadah Eidus, and a Kabbalah Eidus has to be in front of a Beis Din. It happens the Chazon Ish takes issue with that. It's actually the latter part of the Chazon Ish that I had in the materials, but I was only able to copy and paste on the page itself, and it's the top of the next page. But he begins quoting, I think, over here, what it is that the Ksam Sofer said, and he takes issue with the Ksam Sofer. He says, Ksam Sofer, that you need to have a Beis Din for Kabbalas Eidus. He says, why? They're just testifying that they didn't violate any Isser in terms of how they wrote the get or signed the get. That's Eidech Hanem and Bisurin. The Aruch HaShulchan also doesn't think that it's such a big deal. But the second part, what the Ksam Sofer says, the Chazon Ish takes much more seriously independently, and that's not the Chazon Ish that I copied, but the Chazon Ish which is in Siman Kuf Aleph, I think, Kuf Aleph and Sifkat and Lamed, where the Chazon Sifkat and Lamed, and then the subsequent Sifik Ktanim, where the Chazon Ish says that you do need a Beis Din for the Ma'aseh Beis Din. That since nowadays doesn't keep the get herself to be able to show people the get, but her whole proof that she's divorced is through the Ma'aseh Beis Din. So you need a proper Ma'aseh Beis Din, which is signed by 3 independent dayanim. And if I have the Eid Chasima sign on it, that would be an Eid Hameid, which according to many Shitas are not allowed to also serve as a dayan. We say Ein Nas a dayan, and this is something she needs on a deraisa level. So we'd have to be machmir that you couldn't have an Eid Hameid, an Eid who testified directly. If it's an Eid Roeh, like an Eid Masira, so then there's more room to be makel. However, if you read, and Rosh Hashanah takes it very seriously, famously, and also quotes the Chazon Ish very favorably that it's not right that what the Bati didn't do, that they have the Eidei Chasima sign on the Petor and the two days Gerushin. Though the Piskei Tshuva does bring shitos that I have in the materials that you could say the Ma'aseh Bezdin is a Gila Milsa B'Yama, and that really doesn't have to be signed by three Dayanim altogether. It's just like mostly we're relying on the Chazaka that the woman has a reputation that she was divorced. I think in the Divrei Mishpat, a journal which again has been defunct for 30 years or so, Rabbi Landesman has an article in which I haven't read the article in a while, so this is just going back from memory. We should really get a set of the Divrei Mishpat if we can. They're out of print, but they have in the Bezdin of America. We should just copy all of them and buying the copies because it's such a good journal. But Rabbi Landesman has an article in which I believe he says that it depends on how soon after the divorce it is that we're relying on the woman being divorced. If it's very soon before the chazaka is really set in, so then she really needs the Ma'aseh Bezdin, and it could be we really need a proper Ma'aseh Bezdin. But if it's a long time after, she doesn't need it. There's a sheet of the Radbaz. The Radbaz says that if a woman was divorced and she can't find the Ma'aseh Bezdin, it's like 20 years later, whatever. So then we can rely on the chazaka that she was divorced properly if everybody knew that she got a proper get, and we don't need a Ma'aseh Bezdin in that situation. However, when I was chazering the Chazon Ish, I saw that the Chazon Ish seemed to say at the end of his a lengthy discussion. It was 3 sipim in the Chazon Ish on this issue. I think it's either in Siman Kuf or Kuf Aleph, and the Chazon Ish concludes his discussion, it seemed to me, by saying that if the Eidei Chasima were also Eidei Mesira, and that they know because they saw the delivery of the get themselves, so then, and they saw it b'yom, then he says they can serve as the dayanim for the Ma'aseh Bezdin. So most of the time, when we have the Eidim signing on a Tudas Gerushin, we don't have this issue with in the CRC. The CRC, we always have 3 independent dayanim, but most of the time that the Eidim are signing, they're also serving not only as Eidei Chasima, but they're also serving as Eidei Mesira. And if they're not serving as both, it's because it's a get Eidei Shliach, in which case they're only serving as Eidei Mesira, and I don't have a problem of Eidei Nasa Dayan in that particular situation. So it seems to me that even if you're choshesh for the sheet of the Chazon Ish, there's room to be made with respect to the Eidei Chasima signing the document. But the Chassam Sofik is as another explanation as to why you need a full Bezdin in order to sign the Ma'aseh Bezdin. The Chidah, who brings the Targum Yona and all these other arguments in sort of an entertaining fashion, says another reason why it's a good idea. These are all good idea reasons, not reasons to paskin like the Or Zarua, or to paskin like, I'm sorry, the Noda B'Yehuda. Noda B'Yehuda had a case where he was relying on that you should have a Bezdin, but one of them was a puzzle. One of them was no good. So then he says we would say the Nimsa Echem Karvel puzzles. The whole thing is going to be no good. If I say it's a Chumma B'Yamas, I'm not really worried about it. If I don't really need a Bezdin altogether, the Chidah says I'll give you a good reason to have a Bezdin because Hilchos Gittin are really hard and complex. Really hard and complex, and the more, and therefore, that the more people you have, so the more likely you are to do it correctly. I think that's our svara in the CRC. Why we've always had multiple dayanim who are capable of being Mesader Get, as Mordechai knows because he was there writing Gittin for us during last summer at the CRC. Based on the Gemara in Horios, it said that whenever you have a treifa situation, they would always gather all the Chachmei Ir and the Chanin Yerushalmi. It says when Rami Chanina had to deal with a new type of situation, so that he hadn't heard the psak on before, and there were always new questions to come up. So he would always gather 3 people. He'd always have 3 individuals to consult with. So that's another good reason to have it. Also, we follow the chumrah in the Bati Din of the Kavnaki. The Kavnaki says that even though, according to this Seder Haget, you only have to do Hataras Tadarim if you know that the husband made a neder or shvua to give a get or not to give a get. So we're always worried maybe he took a neder. So we always do Hataras Tadarim. Hataras Tadarim, you need a bezdin. Of course, you don't need a perfect bezdin. For Hataras Tadarim, but you need a bezdin. So Tosef, the Tosef's Bikurim, Tosef's Bikurim says 2 interesting things. One is the thing that I mentioned, the name of the Toafos Re'im, that he says if somebody does it, if you have a rabbi who does a get in the nighttime, do not cast aspersions on him, because we hold certainly B'Shas L'Chak is perfectly permissible. There are plenty of Rabbanim, who say and continue to say every get in America is a Shas L'Chak. Every get in America is a Shas Igur. If you don't do it, so you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. There was a case in St. Louis where the sofer was writing a get, and he made a mistake. They had to write a get again. And then the second time around, he made a mistake. He had to write it a third time, and it was already getting late. And there was a question whether to write again at night, and he was already very tired. And there's a question about writing again at nighttime. They said, let's come back tomorrow. We're going to write again tomorrow. And then in the meantime, in the middle of that evening, the husband spoke to some of his friends, and he was talking about his divorce. And he said, yeah, we're fighting over custody, whatever. They said, you're giving her a get. Don't you know you should hold up the get so she'll agree to all of your concessions of what you want in custody and so forth. So then he came back the next day, he contacted the Beis. He said, I'm not coming because I refuse to give the get until she gives in to everything that I want with respect to custody or whatever. And it became an aguna situation. So it really is. You have to be worried that every case in a aguna situation, you don't send people home. So even if it means that you're going to write the get at night, you can write the get at night, once you're ready at that point.
Who gave that eitzah?
What?
Who gave that eitzah?
One of his friends, one of the husband's friends, gave him that eitzah.
So in Yom Kippur, he has to clap you out in a row.
Yeah. Okay, it's a very good point. Yes, I would agree with that. Thank you. Okay, for that ha'ara. So the other thing that the Seres Bikurim says is he quotes a Maharil who talks about how that the Edom really shouldn't be Bali Mum. And he says, why in the world should the Edom not be Bali Mumin? So he says, because maybe we can argue that in this type of situation, and this is what the Re'im says, and I believe he's quoting the Or Zarua, that he says that even if one of the reasons why we don't require a separate standalone bezdin is because for this type of situation, we can say a nasa dayan, the kuliyama, and therefore, even if I would require 3 dayanim, I can use the Ede Messiah and count them as 2 of the dayanim. So in addition to the Masada get, so you're always going to have a Masada get, and you count the 2 Ede Messiah, and guess what? Presto, you always have a built-in bezdin. So not everybody accepts this per se, but this is, if we're going to be makbid based on the Or Zarua himself seems to accept this. And he quotes this. He quotes that the Edom shenim saget lifneim yicholim liyos dayanim midavar v'lo minim kagam ne'ein nase dayan. And we know that with respect to get ayidei shliach for sure. But the Tosefes Bikurim says this even with respect to every single get. If you're going to be machmir, so you can also count the Edei Mesirah for this purpose. But then you would have to follow what the Mechaber said in the Seder get, like with respect to that, make sure that they're not krovim at all to the Masada get, if we're really going to be relying upon the Edei Mesirah for this for this purpose. And now Rav Avaya Yosef talks about this in his Chuvos, and Rav Avaya Yosef says that he justifies the practice that he found in Mitzrayim. He wrote this Shuv in his 20s, by the way, as far as I could tell. So it was Tafshin Ches. Tafshin Ches, he was probably still in his 20s, right? So, I'm sorry, right? Wasn't he? I think so, yeah. So he writes that it's his pekias, his erudition, and his judgment is absolutely unbelievable when you think about, his age. But I mean, it's everything that he did was unbelievable. But Rav Avaya, as a tshuva, justifying the practice of not having a full-fledged bezdin, and he says that along the lines of the chidah, there would be a benefit and a preference to having a bezdin for the hard parts of the process. What does he consider to be the hard, innovative part of the process? Anybody? What's the most innovative part of every single get, where it changes from get to get to get, where it makes the most sense to have a bezdin available? The Chakiva Shemos, that's what he says. So Avaya in his tshuva says that he makes sure to have a bezdin for the Chakiva Shemos. Once he's done with the Chakiva Shemos, then he's not concerned anymore. And now the Aruch HaShulchan says something very, very interesting. He says that when you have a get ayidei shliach, so there are 2 different shitos about we paskin that me'ikar adin the edim can be dayanim for get this livid ayidei shliach. That eid nase dayan, certainly in that context, it's not a problem. And there's even the shliach could be a dayan, but that's only if the shliach is not a karov. And even though we say the shliach shouldn't be a karov because maybe he'll end up being one of the dayanim, we say the Shulchan Aruch paskins that lechatchila you should really not use the shliach because maybe since me'ikar adin shliach could be a karov, so we're worried that we're going to have a pasul dayan. So, but a lot of batei din when they have a get which is delivered by a shliach that has to be in front of a bezdin, they'll have a masada get. They'll have two edim mesira, and the edim mesira will also count as the dayanim. That's very, very common because here it's like even it's only a rabbanim requirement of kiyum, kiyum chasimas. So it's in place of kiyum chasimas. The statement in front of nektar, in front of a bezdin. So in this particular context, there are two different shitos that the Aruch HaShulchan quotes as to whether the two individuals are serving both as edim and as to whether the dayanim should be standing or sitting. So when you have, let's just turn to the Aruch HaShulchan. This is in source 18, Siman Kopman Beis. Kasav Torah, Osam Shenosnim, and the Shulchan Aruch in Sipei, Osam Shenosnim lo b'fneim ain't sarach leishim. They don't have to sit; they can stand. Shama shek v'fanektam v'fanektam sarach lamud. That they should stand. V'yesh mi shama shek hatchil tzirkim leishim. And others say no, they should sit if the v'fanektam is being stated in front of them. So he says, he says obviously they should sit because Parinektam is supposed to be given in front of Dayanim Yeshiva. The day we show them, but the ones who say they should stand, maybe they hold it's like a Gemardin, so therefore you don't really need it. But we don't hold that way. Go to look at 4 lines in the bottom. There's no machlokas. The day we show says that they stand, so as given the Dayanim, that if the Edim Mesira also serving as Dayanim, so those Edim should stand. They should stand. And the Yesh Misha Omer, who says that they should sit. That what it's Shulchan Aruch brings, that we have a chumrah, that the Ramah brings this chumrah, that you should have 2 edim that serve as edim mesira in addition to having 3 who are going to serve as the dayanim to hear the shliach say fanektam fanektam. In which case, we shama shlosh lebezdin muvad. So the muvadi nachon sheishu kedin bezdin. Then obviously they should sit as a bezdin. So my practice is that although most of the time when a get is delivered, we try to have a standalone bezdin, but sometimes it's not feasible for whatever reason, that if the Edim Mesira are also going to serve as the Dayanim, so then I have them stand, and I have the one Dayan who's only serving as a Dayan sit, and in the event that I have 3 separate other Dayanim, in addition to Edim Mesira, then all three of them sit, based on this Aruch HaShulchan. Although you could argue with me and say, no, maybe based on the Aruch HaShulchan, if 2 of the 3 are serving as Edim Mesira, maybe all 3 should stand, so that there'll be more of a unit together, rather than having the Messiah sit and the other 2 stand. But I think it's better this way, although I'm happy to be overruled by others who can bring me, an argument to the contrary. I think it's better this way, because this way you're able to more strongly signify exactly who are serving as the Edim Mesira and make sure that they have the requisite kavanah, that they are serving as the Edim Mesira in addition to serving as Dayanim. So that's my own personal practice, my own personal thought on this subject. I saw an article that was written by Rav Ephraim Cohn, who's the author of Eretz Ephraim. He's a Dayan in the Bezdin Rabbani of Haifa. So he says that he saw the following practices with respect to Siddur Gittin nowadays. This is in addition to the Adius from Rabbi Jachter, but this is an Adus that I guess is more recent, from about 15 years ago. He said Rabbi Ratzian Baron, the Bezdin in Petach Tikva would do Gittin without having 2 additional individuals to serve as a full-fledged Bezdin. Rav Gedalia Axelrod, also the Bezdin of Haifa, would include 2 others, but only for the Mesira. And that was the same practice of Rav Shlomo Amar when he served as the Bezdin in Petach Tikva. And he would also lechatchila try to see to it that the 2 other individuals, what like Bezdin offices can be like in the Rabbanut, but he would try lechatchila to see to it that the other 2 individuals that he would pluck to be present for the Nesina would also be Dayanim. That was like a lechatchila, because not always, but you pluck. Obviously, people look shavim, but he would try lechatchila to see to it that they would actually be dayanim. And finally, this is really a finally, we could say, getting back to the Imre Bina that I quoted at the beginning, that whenever there are legitimate concerns of get isoi, and arguably you can make this point for every single get which is given in New York State, where there's always a spectrum in the background of the get laws, and you always have to make sure that a husband is not only giving the get because somebody is threatening him to invoke and to enforce get law number 2, for example, which is a real problem of isoi when it is invoked, according to some, even if it's not invoked, as we know. So maybe, especially when you you have that type of situation, there, based on the Gemara at the end of Gittin, there is even more of a hakpada to have a proper bezdin for the process, is particularly when it comes to the Nesina Saget, to have a proper standalone bezdin in order to effectuate, as the Imam Bina said, a situation where you have the bezdin properly determining that this was a get that was given willingly, and that that's any type of a statement by the husband that he's giving it willingly that is accepted by the bezdin when they say yes, go forward with the get, and they do the get, would be a fulfillment under those circumstances of a mitzvah lishmoa divei chachamim. And certainly the idea of training all of you in the Choshen Mishpat Kollel, in the Yadin Kollel here, to be qualified dayanim for a gittin was important in terms of just reminding everyone of the importance of consulting and working together as may be necessary in order to ensure that there is the proper consultation and shua barov yoetz, as the Chidah spoke about, as the Rabbi Yosef spoke about, in connection with the Chakiras Shemos, in order to really ensure that even if it's not required, may Ikar Adin, to have a full-fledged bezdin, that we have as much of a chevashap and consultation and presence of knowledgeable individuals as may be possible whenever a get is done, in order to ensure that the gittin be properly done, that they be kosher, and the gam kol am hazeh am kamoya bo b'shalom.